Alabama Supreme Court has declared officially that frozen embryos are children and that destroying them could theoretically then count as murder, which has set the Alabama in vitro fertilization efforts into a bit of a tailspin, as everyone is wondering about their legal status. When Alabama's Supreme Court defined frozen embryos as children, the shock and confusion was immediate. Major hospitals pulled fertility services, and would-be parents scrambled for clarity on what would happen next. Is this Religion News Service? I don't know what. No, this is not. This is a mainstream outlet, I believe.
The BBC? Is that the article you sent us?
This is the BBC. Oh, look what's happening in Alabama. Oh,
now we got to do the accent.
My.
Sky, what did you do?
My. What would the Queen think? Yes.
At
the
least
Alabama
we got this
court,
instead of the Alabama accent.
Yes. See? That's much better. The Alabama court ruled that an existing law, wrongful death of a minor, covers not just fetuses in the womb, but embryos held in a lab or storage facility. Ooh, and, which caught a lot of people's attention, Chief Justice Tom Parker wrote his what do they call it when you agree with them? Wrote his, hey, you guys really are
concurring opinion.
Yes, his concurrence.
Wasn't he Elvis Presley's manager?
Yes, he did that prior, and then he stopped managing. Colonel Tom Parker was Elvis Presley's longtime manager, Caitlin, but he's dead, and this is a different Tom Parker. Probably not a colonel.
Okay.
Although the Tom Parker also wasn't a colonel, and that wasn't even his real name. He made up the whole thing. He was actually a German concert promoter. Anyway, Chief Justice, not the Colonel Tom Parker or the Colonel Sanders, adopted a theologically based view of the sanctity of life in the state constitution. Said, even before birth, all human beings have the image of God, and their lives cannot be destroyed without effacing his glory. He also wrote somewhere, that this article didn't pick up on, that if you destroy an embryo, you are incurring God's wrath. So that's interesting. Some Christians, though, are upset because they actually work with people who are wrestling with infertility, and IVF is one of the ways they work with them. Donald Trump then came out strongly in support of in vitro fertilization, while others, particularly on the far-right Christian nationalist side, came out strongly in support of the ruling against that all in vitro fertilization should be shut down. It's interesting. It's a Christian nationalist thing, apparently, that you shouldn't do in vitro fertilization.
No.
I don't know if there's a unity of thought among what Christian nationalists believe on this.
And a lot of the strongest voices that have been critical of IVF are decidedly not Christian nationalist.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I wasn't using the inverse property or the I forget which of the properties that would be using, the transitive property. I wasn't saying that. I was just saying on my Twitter feed, it's a lot of the same guys that want to get rid of all illegal aliens and put prayer back in school, also want to get rid of in vitro fertilization. So, Sky.
But apparently they would protect undocumented embryos.
No. Oh, yes. But they would send them across the border to be protected elsewhere. Sky, Caitlin, any thoughts?
Lots of thoughts, Phil. Which ones do you want?
Anywhere you want to start.
Goodness, there's so many different angles on this. I think it's interesting that some of the people that are featured in this story are Christians who strongly support IVF and don't like this ruling. So one of the things I'm wrestling with in this whole post-Roe reality is, strictly speaking, there's consistency here on the Alabama courts side of this. I mean, there's a moral and legal and rational consistency to the argument. But there are increasingly voices of conservative Christians going, yeah, we don't like abortion, but we didn't mean this. We didn't mean IVF is bad. So it's kind of interesting to see what happens when conservative pro-life people actually, they're like the dog that caught the car, and now they're not sure what to do with it. Like they're like, okay, we overturned Roe, and now there's implications of it that they didn't think through, that they don't like. And it's interesting to see how that all, works itself out.
Yeah. Yeah. Caitlin.
I think
Thoughts?
that what Skye was just describing is more true of the people for whom this was a issue because you're told that to be a Christian means caring about these things, or it was sort of part of the package deal that I had an idea of what being a Christian in politics meant. There is a really rich tradition, especially among Catholics, but including among Protestants, of being critical of IVF or other related fertility treatments for very consistent reasons with also being pro-life when it comes to abortion. And I have been a little frustrated over the last couple of days with some outlets reporting on this, acting as if this is sort of new and confusing, that there might be some Christian reasons for being cautious, if not critical, of IVF, or acting as if, I just heard the New York Times podcast this morning, sort of making it sound like it's only the most extremist pro-life people that are critical of IVF, which is not true. There certainly are people for whom support of this ruling might be instrumental, meaning they just care about abortion questions, and so this is a win for them in that arena. There are a lot of people who have had really good theological reasons to be cautious about IVF, and there's been a lot of coverage recently. I mean, Christianity Today has written a bunch of articles recently about IVF and what happens to frozen embryos and embryo adoption. And this is a really live, important question for Christians to think critically about. And I think it falls under the category, even probably more so than abortion, though abortion is included as well. The parallel that came to mind for me was more like cremation. It's a really difficult thing to talk about because it is not something that we have a singular long-held belief about that you can fall back on. And it's something that, for a lot of people, it touches something really intimate and sensitive. So to have a criticism of IVF for someone whose child was conceived through IVF will be a really hard criticism to hear. Just like a very legitimate Christian criticism of cremation would be really hard for someone who lost a loved one who was cremated, and that's going to feel incredibly sensitive and challenging for them. So I think that's one thing that makes it really difficult. One of Christianity Today's more recent articles that I thought was really good, it was written by someone who conceived one of their children through IVF, who then said, I now have some questions about how this process works and what it means to not only operate through a process that most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time, creates embryos that will not be implanted, but also does something to kind of separate procreation from the context in which it most naturally happens. And what does that mean for doctors and couples to create life at will? What are there important questions we should ask about how that teaches us to think about children, teaches us to think about ourselves, teaches us to think about God? So I think this is all just to say there is a lot of conversation that already has been happening that we should pay attention to. Christians have been thinking through this question theologically, and it's going to have to continue to happen. But like a lot of these big questions, it's going to have to happen with a lot of sensitivity to say, we aren't making judgments on people's decisions that say, if you did this, you're a horrible, evil human being. But we also can't say, because people are making important decisions about this in their families, we shouldn't think through it as Christians, what it means theologically, how to conceive of it ethically, but also how to conceive of it when it comes to legal restrictions that could come on it.
Yeah. I think what's becoming clearer post-Dobbs, and this is a direction that now some conservative states are pushing further and further in, is the difference in thought between those people that want to that believe personhood should be granted immediately upon conception. That what is a person? A person, and we didn't really have to have this conversation before because it was so hypothetical, to just say life begins at conception. Okay, yeah. And there's no biology textbook that disagrees with that basic statement that a new human life begins at conception. The relevant question that we're now having to wrestle with is, when do we grant the full legal protection of personhood? And that's a different question, where you can have the more immediate position that as soon as a new life has begun to develop, you grant full legal personhood. What we're discovering more and more with the reaction to some of these stronger rules is that most Americans do not have that point of view. They have more of a gradualist sense of most Americans are relatively comfortable with very early term abortion, and very uncomfortable with late-term abortion. So it seems more and more like most Americans, even most Christians, have more of a gradualist perspective that you grant more legal protection as a fetus develops, or particularly when you go beyond the embryonic stage and you actually have a body developing.
I think what we're talking about here, to Caitlin's point and to yours, Phil, is there has been a long, deep, rich theological tradition of the church wrestling with these kinds of ethical issues, and especially in the Catholic Church, it's there. Mm-hmm. But what you're saying, Phil, is that's not how most Americans or even most pro-life Christians have thought about this dynamic. And so when I read up on this over the last couple of days, it was interesting to hear some people say things like, well, the problem with abortion is it's a woman who doesn't want to be a mother. And there's a judgment of that. There's a critique of that they're anti-children, or there are all these stereotypes. And then they look at IVF and they go, well, wait a minute, this is a woman or a couple who want to have children. Mm-hmm. So we should be okay with that. So it's kind of a sentimental ethic where some folks want to judge the woman who is pregnant but doesn't want to be a mother, but we need to totally affirm and encourage the woman who's struggling to get pregnant but wants to be a mother, even if the outcome of both of their decisions is the ending of human life in embryonic form. And that's really interesting because it shows that a lot of people are thinking about this entire issue through the lens of sentimentality rather than through any kind of scientific, moral reasoning or theological framework.
You're a little bit speculating on that, don't you think? Well,
it's a generality. One of the critiques that the left will often make of the pro-life movement is you just want to, quote unquote, control women, right?
Yeah.
And when I read this stuff about people who are anti-abortion but pro-IVF, you can kind of begin to see that take form. Because some people are saying, well, we don't want to give permission to women to end their pregnancy because they don't want to be pregnant, but we do want to give permission to women who want to be pregnant to throw away unused embryos. And it's like, well, what's the difference? The difference is, in one case, a woman wants to have a child. In the other case, a woman doesn't want to have a child, but they both result in the end of human life.
Yeah, but the people that I follow that are the most adamantly anti-abortion are also the most adamantly anti-IVF.
Yes, but there's a large chunk of people who are not that. They are anti-abortion, but they're pro-IVF.
Yes.
That's what's so fascinating about this.
But those are also the people, I think those are people that see more nuance, because those are also people who would say, I'm against abortion, but I don't think women should be thrown in jail for having an abortion.
Right.
Whereas the absolutists say, abortion should be illegal.
Right.
You should be tried for murder if you have an abortion. And in vitro fertilization is also murder.
Right.
So to a certain extent, that's a more consistent ethic. And so people kind of get caught. And I don't like that ethic. I don't like where that ethic leads, but I'm not sure on what moral grounds I'm standing when I say I don't want to take it that far.